If you want that good feeling that comes from doing things for other folks, then you have to pay for it in abuse and misunderstanding. I think there's a misunderstanding that feminism is about bringing men down to bring women up, and it's certainly not that. Is an intelligent human being likely to be much more than a large-scale manufacturer of misunderstanding? It is by universal misunderstanding that all agree. For if, by ill luck, people understood each other, they would never agree. Logic, the art of thinking and reasoning in strict accordance with the limitations and incapacities of the human misunderstanding. The effort to blur the lines between Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib reflects a deep misunderstanding about the different legal regimes that apply to Iraq and the war against Al-Qaeda. When a scientist is ahead of his times, it is often through misunderstanding of current, rather than intuition of future truth. In science there is never any error so gross that it won't one day, from some perspective, appear prophetic. The prison industrial complex is perhaps, at least domestically, the most striking example of us putting profit before people. It all stems from one basic misunderstanding, that the public good can be shepherded by private interests. In human intercourse the tragedy begins, not when there is misunderstanding about words, but when silence is not understood. As forces of hate in this country and worldwide try to pull Muslims and Christians apart, we are in desperate need of a unifying force that can bridge the widening gap of interfaith misunderstanding and mistrust. That force could be the message of love, peace, and forgiveness taught by Jesus and accepted by followers of both faiths. The notion that the U.S. can impose its will unilaterally on the World Bank reflects a fundamental misunderstanding about how multilateral organizations should work. In minority communities there's a sensitivity, often a knee-jerk reaction, to critical representations. There's a misunderstanding of what an artist does. I think there's a big misunderstanding on the value of migrants. Worrying that banning flag desecration would inhibit free speech reveals a misunderstanding of the flag's fundamental nature. But let there be no misunderstanding. The war against terror is every bit as important as our fight against fascism in World War II, or our struggle against the spread of communism during the Cold War. Let us not act out of fear and misunderstanding, but out of the values of inclusion, diversity, and regard for all that make our country great. As the Persians wrote very little about how they ran their affairs, the Greek propaganda of the 5th century BC has for centuries gone virtually unchallenged. Indeed, for Edward said, it was the beginning of Europe's long habit of misunderstanding and ill-informed contempt of the Middle East. If you ask the question of Americans, should we pay our bills? 100% would say yes. There's a significant misunderstanding on the debt ceiling. People think it's authorizing new spending. The debt ceiling doesn't authorize new spending, it allows us to pay obligations already incurred. There seems to be a terrible misunderstanding on the part of a great many people to the effect that when you cease to believe you may cease to behave. I'm so sick of people misunderstanding Asians in America and what we're about. Love involves a peculiar unfathomable combination of understanding and misunderstanding. We don't need no more danger, we don't need no more difficulties, we don't need no more misunderstanding, and we don't need no more violence. We need the people to see each other and know of each other, feel each other, touch each other, share with each other, and change hearts with each other. The Gospel of Judas really has been a surprise in many ways. For one thing, there's no other text that suggests that Judas Iscariot was an intimate, trusted disciple, one to whom Jesus revealed the secrets of the kingdom, and that conversely, the other disciples were misunderstanding what he meant by the gospel. To label me an intellectual is a misunderstanding of what that is. Change comes with both fear and some pain. Those two ingredients create mistrust, misunderstanding and misinformation. Such is the process of democracy. In South America, I heard the 8th Symphony of Beethoven, and the young conductor thought, Beethoven must be heroic. But this is peace which shouldn't be heroic. And this was such a misunderstanding, such a deep misunderstanding. It does grieve me to think there are people misunderstanding my heart on an issue. You always risk people misunderstanding you when you say anything. Where misunderstanding serves others as an advantage, one is helpless to make oneself understood. The world only goes round by misunderstanding. Long term I do believe internationally there is a huge misunderstanding of Russia. When we talk about pay equality, I think we're misunderstanding where the problem lies. Many seniors understand that Social Security is social insurance as opposed to a program where we put money aside for our own retirement. But most elderly individuals think they're getting their money back, so it isn't selfishness as much as a misunderstanding. Most quarrels amplify a misunderstanding. It may be added, to prevent misunderstanding, that when I speak of contemplated objects in this last phrase as objects of contemplation, the act of contemplation itself is of course an enjoyment. My family was very conservative, and I had a traditional upbringing. I was not brought up to be a sex symbol, nor is it in my nature to be one. The fact that I became one is probably the loveliest, most glamorous and fortunate misunderstanding. The word Christianity is already a misunderstanding. In reality there has been only one Christian, and he died on the cross. Conflict, of course, comes about because of the misuse of power and the clash of ideals, not to mention the inflammatory activities of unscrupulous and bigoted leaders. But it also arises, tragically, from an inability to understand and from the powerful emotions which, out of misunderstanding, lead to distrust and fear. The fact is that much misunderstanding is often caused by our modern attempts to limit too strictly the meaning of a Greek word. It's a common misunderstanding, that when a bisexual person is dating someone of the opposite sex that they are now straight, or if they are dating someone of the same sex they are now gay. I always think that in nearly every instance things that turn ugly, they almost invariably do so because of a misunderstanding, or because of poor communication. There is far more misunderstanding of Islam than there is, I think, of the other religions of the world. So many things are said of it by those who do not belong to that faith. My biggest concern is people misunderstanding me. I think the new aesthetic is a series of observations. I think most of the trouble people have had with it comes from a misunderstanding of it as a movement. To be misunderstood can be the writer's punishment for having disturbed the reader's peace. The greater the disturbance, the greater the possibility of misunderstanding. There's never going to be a great misunderstanding of me. I think I'm a little whack. I think that it's more important for an economist to be wise and sophisticated in scientific method than it is for a physicist because with controlled laboratory experiments possible, they practically guide you. You couldn't go astray. Whereas in economics, by dogma and misunderstanding, you can go very sadly astray. Descriptions of inner, spiritual processes are much more liable to misunderstanding than descriptions of events in the physical world. Such misunderstandings arise easily because the life of the soul is in constant movement and because we fail to bear in mind that the life of the soul is very different from life in the physical world. There was a misunderstanding with Barca. Something happened that I didn't like, but I prefer to keep it for myself. I have a profound empathy for people who are in the public eye. Whether they manifest it themselves or whether it happened by accident, it doesn't matter to me. I think there's a great misunderstanding of what it is to be famous. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.